Good afternoon. You're all very welcome to the third webinar in the Switchshop series of webinars celebrating Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Today's webinar is Zero Trust Security, Network Visibility, Integration and Control. This webinar looks to explore the theme of defense in depth and the importance of taking a layered approach to securing your networks and systems with tools that don't just sit at the gateway or on the client, but can provide effective mechanisms for defense detection and, importantly, response throughout the network. For those of you who don't know Switchshop, we are a leading value-added reseller in delivering network and security infrastructure solutions. We work heavily in the public sector across secondary and higher education, local government, and of course with the NHS. We are first and foremost a technically led company. Our focus is putting the right solutions to the right customers. Of course, we factor in budget restraints and real-world practicalities, but first and foremost, we look to deliver the right technical solution. To this end, we invest heavily in our professional service team and ensure that we are working with the best manufacturers in the industry. We are here today with Aruba Networks, with whom we are one of just a handful of platinum level partners in the UK, which is testament not just to our sales position, but rather how technically capable we are and how we work collaboratively with our customers. Before I hand you over to our speaker, Danny Jump, Policy Manager, ClearPass Policy Manager at Aruba, I'd like to draw your attention to the three tabs on the top right of your screen. The first tab is chat. This is a public window, so if you require any audio support, the team are here. Please post your issues or queries. The next tab is questions. We've allocated 15 minutes at the end of the session to post questions. Third tab is poll. We would ask you to please click on this during the course of this webinar. It's very quick. There are only 4 questions and they'll just simply require a yes or no answer. At any time during the session, please feel free to post here, particularly with the questions, and we will do our utmost to respond to all. Any of the questions we don't get to will be answered directly following the webinar by email. Finally, a quick reminder about the 4th webinar in the series, which will take place on the 21st of October at 2 p.m, Securing Your Data, the Final Frontier. So without further delay, I'm pleased to hand over to Danny Jump. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you for that warm welcome, and I have to make sure I use the correct terminology. Good afternoon. I say that because I'm in California, and it's bright and early here for me on a Wednesday morning. But without any further ado, let me get into the presentation. We have limited time. For those of you that don't know ClearPass or do know ClearPass, I'm one of the product managers based out of here in Santa Clara, Aruba's headquarters, and we're going to spend the next 45 minutes really trying to focus on how visibility and also some of the other sessions that Switchshop have run in previous weeks allow you to really take more advantage of your infrastructure, and hopefully some of this will come clearer through the session. Being able to leverage basically the investments you've made in other security products that allows you to get more out of ClearPass as a platform. So a real quick slide about me. This might make you laugh, think, why is this guy saying he's not from Australia or New Zealand when I'm preaching to a bunch of Brits? Well, normally, every time I'm presenting to customers around the world, the first question I get asked is, I'm either from Australia or New Zealand, which I find quite amazing when you probably recognize my Northern Manchester and Mancunian accent. But however, that's just the world we live in today. I've been here at Aruba about 8 years as a product manager developing the ClearPass platform. Prior to that, I had a life in and around service provider networks at Juniper, and then other previous stuff in my life was really focused around IBM. And I'm an added sports fan, if we're not all. So look, I want to start off with this slide. It's a slide I use a lot and talk to extensively, and really it talks about where you are. Wherever you have in terms of NAC, and let's just talk about what NAC is. It's network access control, right? It's being able to make an informed decision around the device as it gets on your network. So put that in another speak. If it's got a MAC address, I want to be able to identify the device, know what it is, understand, build a compliance state, and then make a decision that lets it access resources. Or said another way, more importantly, what resources it cannot access. And that's been around for probably 20, 25 years. An old school NIC was very mature. It failed. Nobody deployed it. And it basically died a horrible death. But then about 10, 12 years ago, wireless became very pervasive as the connectivity of choice. And with that, enterprises, and you'll probably all hopefully agree and nod your heads, quickly realized that a simple PSK on an enterprise SSID was not enterprise-grade security for connectivity. So what do we have? What could we fall back on? How could we deliver wireless over our infrastructure but make it secure? And we fell back to what we call .1x, or NAC within wireless. And that's been very successful. And here at Aruba, you probably know us more as a wireless company, but we do a lot with the Policy Manager platform, my platform, 10,000 plus customers around the world, very, very extensive, every vertical you can think of, a lot of success. Just going back to that wireless connectivity, when people first deployed wireless with NIC, and this slide would normally build out, but I don't have those, I don't have that available to me today. Most people are running what I call today general policy-driven NIC, and that NIC is along the lines of you authenticate, and generally we're looking at the user, not the device too much. You authenticate, we validate that authentication, and we let you onto the network. And then ClearPass or NAC is typically done then for the day. It's because we're not an inline technology. I don't see what you're doing. I'm not a proxy. I'm not a firewall. I'm an offline. I'm one-armed. So I'm done. So unless you come back or you leave the network and come back that same day, I don't re-authenticate you again until you probably come back the following day. And in 2020, that approach for NAC really does not work. NAC needs to be more pervasive. It needs to be more inclusive. And it needs to be more real time, what I call event or cyber or threat driven NAC. And don't let that worry you in that NAC only works off threats. What I'm trying to say is we want to be able to make changes to the infrastructure in terms of how we let you and the device that you're using, or maybe sometimes there's no user behind the device. Maybe it's one of these so-called headless devices, or the tsunami of the last few years has called them IoT devices. Maybe we want to make a change to the access for that device to the infrastructure, like I said, to limit or restrict what applications and data you can and cannot access. And that's the way of the world today. That's where I think NAC needs to be going. And we've been building that infrastructure. And we'll talk specifically today a little bit about Fortinet and Ativo, which have been some of the previous iterations of this webinar that Switchshop have run. We'll talk a little bit about them, but we'll also talk more agnostically about how other parts of your infrastructure you can leverage to drive that event or cyber-driven NAC. Now, the other far right-hand side of my slide is this other world that we live in, and this comes back to that IoT story. And we're living in this connect everything and anything world. If it's got a MAC address, like I said, it's being connected to the network, whether you like it or not. And generally, for a lot of times, what I hear is I don't know it's been connected. I don't know it was going to be connected. And hell, I don't really know what it's being used for sometimes. So we'll talk about how we can address those challenges today. And some of this will pivot around what everyone else is talking about for the last sort of year, 18 months. And that's this concept of zero trust networking. And for me, that is a concept of never trust, always verify. So we'll talk about that a little bit and how it relates to IoT, or as I call it, just the tsunami of IoT devices. Now, in this build out of my slide that I can't show you today, I will then tell you about how NAC has been very successful in the wireless space. But what we've seen in later years, probably the last 3-4 years, we've seen a lot of our larger customers who deployed NAC very successful in the wireless space, looking to take that technology now into the wired space. There was this misnomer of, hey, Danny needs to get into the building to get to a switch port to plug into the infrastructure before he can connect to an application, whereas wireless is outside in the car park. But nowadays, it's really more about understanding and delivering a ubiquitous experience for your users and your devices, regardless of whether they're on wired or wireless. And what I mean there is, if I'm on a wired port and then I disconnect and jump onto a wireless SSID, my security should follow me. Or if I go the other way, I'm walking around the building, I'm on wireless, I sit down, I dock, I'm now on wired. the security that follows me and my device should follow me regardless of how I connect. This also extends to home, to VPN. And obviously the challenges we have today with COVID, with the vast majority of the workforce working from home, we have ways to interface with a lot of the common VPN providers that allow us to basically move to what we call within Aruba a role-based trust. And that role-based trust really is something we've been talking about for like 10, 12 years. We also used to talk about adaptive security. In essence, the concept of a role and adaptive security, in my own humble opinion, is what people are now starting to talk about with zero trust networking. Or said another way, we've been doing it for 15 years in Aruba. It's nothing new to us. So just to summarize this slide, this is not a Gartner view of the world or a Forrester or whatever your favorite analyst is. This is just Danny's view. It's my progression of the NAC in the last sort of 20 years. So moving on. If you're looking at NAC, or if you have NAC, I would say to you there are three key pillars or foundations that you need for that project to be successful. And it really starts with visibility. Being able to identify anything that connects to the infrastructure across wide wireless or VPN is really the foundation of doing what we do within the Policy Manager platform. It becomes the foundation of building policy and identity. And you'll see we list a bunch of logos on there. And those aren't a limited set of logos. That's all the space we have, basically. And those logos flow through everything that we do. There is a concept of a better together story where we have Aruba wired or wireless with ClearPass. But for a lot of the foundational stuff that we do with the platform, we don't really care too much what your wired or wireless infrastructure is. Certainly when it comes to visibility and we're identifying the devices that you're connecting, we do that across any vendor's infrastructure. So just building up on that foundation, the next level of that, the visibility drives control. So I connect a device, I authenticate, I know what type of device that I'm using, I know other things around posture, compliance, OS level, patching level. There's a bunch of things I do to gather and harness that information. And that then drives the control aspect. And the control aspect is that piece of saying, okay, this device, this user can access these resources. And more importantly, as I keep saying, cannot access these other resources. And again, that control extends to across any wider wireless vendor's network. Some more granular control exists across Aruba infrastructure than it does across some other vendors' infrastructure. But again, the foundation and the fundamentals become the same. And then the response bit is the piece I'm going to spend a little bit more time today talking about. It's this closed system of security. It's this layered approach of security where Danny gets on the network, everything's fine, we've let him on, he's accessing the right applications, and then something within the infrastructure, remember, Aruba ClearPass doesn't see what you're doing after you've been permitted access. Maybe an IDS, a firewall, maybe something like a TiVo that's setting laws and traps within the network. Something detects that either the way that I'm working or my device is accessing something that is either outside my profile or I'm doing something erroneous on the network or something malicious. And what triggers there is a series of events where I consume an alert or event from something on the network, firewall, IDS, IPS, a TiVo, a SIM system, whatever it is. And I use that event then to trigger a workflow where I can then either disconnect the user, put them in a captive portal, change their access priorities, and then start triggering other more important things like help desk ticket work system flows, or emailing the user, or emailing the CISO. There's a whole bunch of active and passive events that happen as part of that response when something is detected by the network. And when I talk about the network, I'm really talking about the security systems that you are investing heavily in, which traditionally have been very siloed. They don't talk to other things on the network. What ClearPass allows you to do is leverage those investments to make a much tighter security story. Now, there's a new world out there that's coming, and this is not a sci-fi story. It's a parallel world, and we all live in what we call the IT world. And I don't know if there's anyone on from what's called the OT world, or sometimes we call it the ICS, the Industrial Control System. But there's this parallel world out there, and I'll skip through this one fairly quickly, just to say that We've been doing a lot of work with a number of partners, namely people like Siemens, Hirschman, and a bunch of security specialists in the OT world. And the OT world basically is all about these networks that deliver your national infrastructure, maybe power grids, wastewater, traffic light systems, things that do not allow for downtime. In the IT world, we're very familiar with taking, patching Sunday, the first of the quarter, or I don't know, whatever your cycle might be. You can get downtime to patch and upgrade systems. But in the OT world, these guys tell me that if we take 5 minutes downtime in a year, that was a really bad year. Right? We don't take downtime. What does that mean? It means they don't patch their systems. What does that mean? It means they're so open to abuse. So there's a whole world of OT, IT collaboration, because the OT world's coming to us IT guys saying, hey, can you give us some guidance around how you've patched and basically built security around your network? Because these OT systems all run on Ethernet. They're all Ethernet connected devices. So it's definitely something to think about. Maybe you're not in the OT world, but it's certainly going to be coming for some people. And just one more marketing slide, and I'm going to start talking more about the product. And this is just, again, it's more of the foundation of you have to have that visibility to drive control. But why you want that visibility is to identify those devices, group them, set them as roles, build out an infrastructure where you can then start doing things like segmentation. But again, it comes back to visibility. It comes back to profiling and fingerprinting those devices on the network. Because fundamentally, you want that segmentation, you want that zero trust networking, because you want to look through what we call reduce the attack surface. And a simple way of thinking that is grouping together similar type devices which access similar applications. So you can limit the connectivity from that VLAN or that group of roles or that tags or those labels, however you want to group and identify those devices, to the right and limited applications. But again, visibility. So that attack surface, we'll talk about it, is all about segmentation. And then the orchestration is what I talked about before. We do this through something we call Security Exchange, or the Aruba Security 360 Fabric. It's this shared infrastructure where we leverage the investments that you have made in these security products to drive information and metadata and context into Policy Manager through open frameworks that allows us to basically orchestrate your security across your wide and wireless edge, and also across your firewalls and other places. Anywhere we can do enforcement, we built these infrastructure interfaces that allows us to actually federate security to other parts of your network. And then, like I say at the end, detect and mitigate, or else what's the point? There's no point a firewall telling me that it's seen an alert or an error or some erroneous activity on the device if I do nothing about it apart from sending emails to the help desk or send a syslog. It needs to be proactive. So that's the other sort of fundamental across this OT, IoT, because those boundaries are all blurring between those departments. So I'm touched on roles, and roles is really one of the fundamental driving blocks for everything we do within Policy Manager. It also relates to what we do within Aruba infrastructure in general, and where we can, we use this concept of a role to drive and federate that security to other parts of the network, for example, Fortinet firewalls. But the way I want you to think about this is, and visualize this, Policy Manager sits at the sort of inflection point between all the users on the left-hand side of the slide. So whether they are visitors, administrators, that can be network administrators, or some higher ranking employee because they have some sort of VIP status, or status as I like to say over here. Could be contractors, or it could be these headless devices, these BYOD type devices as well. Devices that are not owned by the corporate enterprise, but you have a policy that permits people to bring them to the network. ClearPass is at this juncture of ensuring that all these users, however they want to connect to the network, we leverage all these features in ClearPass to basically drive this concept of the role. And like I said, the role then becomes this tag, this label that we use then extensively to federate the policy and the security persona of users and devices. And you'll hear us talk more about roles in the future in this session. So for those of you that don't know about Policy Manager, let me give you a quick run through what the core of the product is. I'm just going to take a quick swig of coffee. Still morning here, so it's still coffee time. Policy Manager is the core product that's doing all the authentication, authorization, validating people in Active Directory, talking to Okta, talking to Ping, doing all those validations of user identity. And it's doing those all real time. We're tapping into all these third-party products we'll talk about more in the next few slides. It's understanding what the compliance state of it is of a device. Is it patched? Is it up to date? Is it being used by the right person? Is it in the right location? Doing all these decisions real time. And then it's basically building a policy that is used to determine how that device gets on the network. Policy Manager ships as a hardware appliance, probably unsurprisingly on HPE server hardware. We support virtual deployments, ESXi, Hyper-V, KVM, and we support cloud. When we talk about cloud, we're talking about in the VPC. So you running ClearPass either in Azure, or which was recently released about 2 months ago, or running it as an AMI image in Amazon. And just like everything else in this world, right, it's coffee or fries or whatever, we do small, medium, and large. But what's important is, and what the visualization at the bottom is, where it's showing ClearPass boxes grouped together, is you can take our largest box, 50,000 concurrent sessions, and group them together. We have several customers who are running in the 500,000 concurrent sessions, and we have one customer that's over 1 million. The takeaway that's really important for you if you're looking at global or just large deployments, and I could tell you about Los Angeles Unified School District over here, the school district for K through 12 in LA, they run 40 boxes, 22 data centers across about 650,000 students who all have iPads. Or I could tell you about some of the large software vendors, a very large one based in Redmond, just outside Seattle. You all know that is, who use ClearPass globally across the world. Or people who build planes just outside Seattle. They run us globally across the world. So you can run it, in a metropolitan area network like Los Angeles School District, or you could be a Microsoft or a Boeing. Everyone knows who we're talking about. Or you could be a Disney, run it globally across the parks and the hotels. It's basically limitless how you deploy it. On top of Policy Manager, we have 3 other key platforms. We have Guest, and Guest is exactly what it's all about. It's about allowing a workflow for users to get onto a Guest infrastructure to access the internet. It comes in multiple flavors: anonymous guests, self-registration, sponsored registration, which is the most popular that we see within enterprises. And then we also have a social logon for Guest. Just different ways to get users onto the infrastructure. We then have what's called Onboard and Onguard. Onboard is all about a workflow for users who want to do the process of BYOD, bring your own device, choose your own device. It's a CAPTCHA portal-driven approach where we allow you to next, install, finish type approach to basically have a user have their device self-configured, self-provisioned via Policy Manager in a frictionless way without them having to go and get help from IT. So it's a self-service tool. And then OnGuard is an agent that runs on your endpoint. So yes, it's an agent, another piece of software that you have to install. But what it allows us to do is capture real-time information around those devices that are on your network and feed that information into Policy Manager. OnGuard comes in a persistent agent, i.e. it's permanently running, it's permanently monitoring based upon the compliance policy that is configured. We have a dissolvable agent, which would run once and then disappear. Poof. Or we have something called a Zero Touch agent, which basically self-installs, silent install, and is able to monitor the client in the background. So those are the sort of core components we have within Policy Manager. So this is a slide I used, and I changed it. Normally, I have the Great Wall of China on here, right? But I thought, as it's the UK, as it's my friends in England, Britain, I'll use Adrian's Wall. And this is where we're at within networking and security, right? The way I look at this, and this is where Policy Manager sits. We sit between networking and security. We're at that boundary. And networking, what do we want to do? We want to connect everything and everyone together. Whereas in the security world, we're basically trying to restrict everything and everyone from working together because that's what we do. So we're at this boundary with Policy Manager. And Policy Manager, we see being operated by both teams. Never generally one. It's generally not a shared resource. It's one or the other. But what I tell customers, though, all the time, this is why this slide is here, is that Policy Manager really should be a shared resource, in my opinion. you should be using Policy Manager to allow you to connect everything to the infrastructure, the networking piece, securely. And also it's the security product because it allows you to build those policies that actually does or delivers the ability to restrict what those devices can connect to. So depending on where you are within your enterprise or who you represent within your company, I want you to think about where ClearPass, where policy fits for you. But I also want you to think about how working with your larger team, I think there's a lot more value from a product like ClearPass between networking and security. So just that. And this is coming, and this sort of drives this next slide. So we see ourselves at the inflection point between, reducing all these three challenges, accelerating decisions, reducing the attack surface through things like segmentation, and being able to detect. I'm not actually detecting the attack because remember I'm not in line, but I'm consuming from all those products that are on your infrastructure that do detect attacks, alerts and alarms, and threat analysis that allows me to actually make those decisions. And we call this the Aruba 360 Secure Fabric. And this is how it looks. As I should visualize it. To the left, we have connect everything. And as you'll see, we talk about multi-vendor switching, multi-vendor wireless LANs. We have a huge preference that you use Aruba wider wireless infrastructure. And there is definitely a better together story where we can deliver niche functionality that delivers enhancements over if that wider wireless switching is not Aruba. But if you're a Cisco or a Brocade or a Arista or your AeroHive or a Ruckus or whatever, Policy Manager still has huge advantage. And we have huge customers globally who have all non-Aruba infrastructure or mixed vendor infrastructure. Mixed vendor is very, very common. And then on the right-hand side, you have all these other products that typically I see enterprises investing in, whether it's firewalls, whether it's IDS, IPS, IPAM, vulnerability scanners, endpoint security systems, EDR, EPPs, MDM systems. And these products all have context on users and devices. And it's traditionally very siloed and it's not shared very often. What we want to encourage you to do is hook ClearPass into these products. Through open REST APIs, we built interface with over 160 vendors today that allows us to ingest information that's relevant to us about those users and those devices. And we use that within our policy to drive a much richer, more granular policy decision. And this ecosystem includes vendors like Fortinet and TiVo, who I know Switchshop are very close to, and we're very close to, and work very closely with them over here. There is huge value in being able to work and interoperate with firewalls as an enforcement point, and especially with something like TiVo, which is doing deception-based networking, allows us to actually have a much more rich, insightful view of what's happening on the network. Now, this is a slide that would normally build out again, and I circle firewall here, not because I want to talk about Fortinet. And as you'll see on here, we talk about authentication, we have SIM in the bottom left. MDM is a very active space. As you'll see, we basically cover every MDM vendor that exists today of any relevance. And then on the networking, we talk about a bunch of networking vendors that we support. We've touched on that a few times. In the firewall space, look, we know that you as a company have a choice in what wider wireless infrastructure you deploy. We also realize you have a choice of what firewall vendor you supply. We have a very tight relationship with Fortinet. And people find that surprising because Fortinet do some wireless. Fortinet do a product called Fortinet, which was an acquisition from Bradford Networks. But actually, Fortinet and ourselves, certainly on the firewall side, are very, very close. But what I'm saying here is you have a choice. And that's the same view that we take with Policy Manager. Just as I do care, you choose different vendors for your infrastructure, you can choose different vendors for your firewall. The reason why there's a square around that, and the reason why there's a square around endpoint, is because we invest very heavily in those integrations, because Gartner and other analysts tell us that most enterprises spend about 75% of their budget in those two areas. And if you look at things like my Palo Alto integration or my Fortinet integration or my McAfee or Cylance or SentinelOne or whatever, those integrations sometimes have gone through 8 to 9 revs. And that rev is really just an improvement on the feature. As the firewall vendors have added more functionality, we've gone back and looked at that and said, where is that applicable to me? Where does it make sense that I build a tighter integration between that vendor and policy manager so I can deliver a better solution to my customers? So that's the reason why they're squared, is because we have a lot of investment. We spend a lot of time working specifically on firewall and endpoint. And there's a lot more endpoint vendors than there are, I guess, what I would call next generation firewall vendors out there. Now, Ativo's on here as well under the area of deception. And Ativo has super sexy technology. And these guys, if you don't know what they do, these guys basically are setting lures. I think of them as a honeypot 2.0, honeypots from the 80s and the early 90s. They basically set lures and traps within a network that if you have those naughty people in your infrastructure trying to find access to information, Ativo basically sets these lures, fake credentials, fake applications, fake web servers, fake database servers that look like real systems for your enterprise, but effectively have got nothing but junk in them. What they allow you to do is have these naughty people attack these systems. And then what Ativo does, we have this closed loop system with Ativo that allows them to basically alert to us that a device on a user is trying to access one of the fake systems, and we can basically take them off the network, quarantine them, and do other things with them. So it's a really cool integration between the Ativo guys and within Policy Manager. Now, one way that we deliver, and I'm going to spend some more time on Ativo, unfortunately, in a minute, but this is a very important slide. So when we build these integrations, there's a bunch of slides up, a bunch of logos on here, and there's a bunch more. We deliver them through a enhancement to our Security 360 fabric that we call extensions. And an extension basically is an app. So think of it as an app on your phone. You want to install the latest CrowdStrike or the latest Sophos or the latest Palo Alto integration. You go to the extension store from your browser within Policy Manager, and you download that app locally to your box, and you configure it. So why, Danny, didn't you actually build it into the core product? Why do you have it as an app? Very good question. The reason why we do that is we're quite rigid on how we release our major software within Policy Manager. And at times, the cadence I need for delivering integrations has to be in the terms of sometimes days and weeks. So maybe there's a new feature comes out. I can't wait 6 months until I target a release vehicle for the latest ServiceNow integration or the latest Cylance integration or whatever it is. I need to be able to deliver it next week, because within the extension framework, it's very separate from Policy Manager. We develop, we code, we test, we document, then we post it to a store, and then it's ready. That process can be a matter of, even from start to finish, from building something new to end, can be less than 2 weeks. Documentation can be the longest part of it. And when we're doing enhancements, it can be days. So rather than having to wait 2-3 months before I can get something out to our field, we use this extension approach to be able to deliver these integrations very, very quickly. So it's a great way of getting stuff into the hands of our customers without having to wait. And we also have a very extensive sort of API framework within Policy Manager that allows you to build code. I'm a Python guy, whatever you may well be, your coding preference of choice. But we basically try to make Policy Manager as open as possible. And our third-party vendors leverage these APIs to actually do integrations themselves. Sometimes we don't have to build them like an extension like we talked about on the previous slide. ClearPass is so open, they will build their own integrations with guidance from us on how to do that. And Fortinet will be an example of that, as I'll talk to you about in a minute. But really quickly, if you don't know about Ativo, or you weren't able to catch some of the Ativo previous sessions that Switchshop ran, like I said, what they do is they set these lures and traps within the network. And as I said, I think about it like a honeypot 2.0. And then people that are attacking your infrastructure are basically follow the breadcrumbs, if you like, to use fake credentials and attack fake systems. But what they built into their botnet system is the ability for them, when they detect these attacks, to trigger an alert to ClearPass. So ClearPass, because remember, think about this, Policy Manager owns the edge of the network, whether it's VPN, wired or wireless. Anything that connects, the first thing it talks to is me. So if I'm in control of the edge, I can basically determine how that device gets on the network, right? So I could also take a device off or quarantine it. And that's basically what we're doing here with the Evo guys. They send an alert, we can then disconnect or change the access priorities for that device that's affected or being used as a jump box. And yeah, I've talked to that. And then on the Fortinet side, I want to spend a little bit of time on Fortinet because they've done a fantastic job. They built this integration into what's called FortiFabric. And they built all this integration. So, sorry, let me just go back to Fortinet, Ativo. All that integration is basically built between both vendors, API driven, shared development work on both sides. Fast forward to Fortinet. I did not do one line of coding for the Fortinet integration into FortiFabric. They basically built an ecosystem within FortiFabric that allows third-party vendors, a bit like our Aruba Security 360 Fabric, to interoperate with their products, specifically in this case, FortiGates. So they basically ingest from ClearPass via APIs all the roles that exist within Policy Manager. Remember, a role is what we use to determine the access credentials for a user. Another way of thinking of this is we take all the data in, we distill it down, and that's all the data about the user. Maybe I look at your Active Directory membership group information. I look at the device that you're using. I look at whether it's domain joined. Is it BYOD? Is it patched? Is it running Windows 8.1, Windows 10? Is it running this patch, that patch? Is the disk encrypted? The whole bunch of data I have on that device. I use all that data, I distill it down, what pops out the bottom is this role. What Fortinet do is they take those roles into FortiFabric, they expose them via FortiManager into their configuration manager, which allows them to do direct mapping between the role and the policy. So what happens when you authenticate on the network? Policy Manager real time sends via something called a context server action. So it sends a real time alert to say something like, Thomas, this Mac OS version, you're in marketing, their IP address, and the role of the user. All that data is shared with the FortiFabric. Then that information is then disseminated to the gateway. The gateway is the enforcement point, and it's going to do it based upon the role. So basically, we're projecting the concept of how ClearPass and all the data it has about a user or device, we're pushing that role to the firewall to basically trigger the enforcement. It's not doing it on the IP address. It's not doing it on, you're in this zone or that zone. It's doing it on the role. And it's simpler, but I think it drives an enhanced level of security because the role represents so much more data than just, say, an IP address or a port number, something like that. Super powerful, super impressive. You guys got this delivered at the end of 2019. Really powerful. And then there's another flip side to this. And so that's us sharing information about how the enforcement should happen within the FortiGates. The flip side is, well, what if they then see that device doing something naughty, erroneous, malicious? They have the concept of sending an alert to us that we consume in something called the ingress event engine. It allows me to consume an alert and then trigger some sort of remediation. It could just be a simple quarantine, disconnect, captive portal, or maybe I change the role. Remember, the role is used to determine what you can and cannot access. So we can use that role that's now changed based upon the alert that I consumed from Fortinet to basically then push that role back to the firewall to say, treat this user like this now, rather than how you were before. Again, it's a closed loop system. It's real time. It's event driven. It's the way that I think NAC should be working in 2020. Time is starting to get against me. I'm going to skip a couple of slides. Now look, Policy Manager is about authenticating devices, and it falls into this thing of AAA, authentication, authorization, and something called accounting. Just for now, let's just think about authentication. And there's two camps for authentication. There's the camp of .1x, or sometimes we refer to as radius, or 802.1x. And that is certainly my preferred and Aruba's preferred method of connectivity. But not all devices unfortunately, are able to do .1x. A lot of devices fall into the right-hand side of the slide, the IoT or the IIoT or MIoT, that's industrial Internet of Things, or medical Internet of Things. These are dumb devices. And look, this is nothing different than us connecting a printer to the network 10 years ago on an Ethernet card, right? A device that does not authenticate is a dumb device, and by definition, for me, is an IoT device. So it's nothing new. But what is new is that historically, people would do something called MAC authentication for these devices that were unable to authenticate, a permit list or a denial list, if you like. I want you to rethink that process. I do not want you to be authenticating headless devices through MAC lists. First of all, administratively, it's a nightmare. But more importantly, it's a security hole. It leads into this area, something called MAC spoofing. I can run one command on my Mac here, and I can simulate any MAC address in the world. I could become the Epson printer that's in my study here at home very easily, and I could get on the network using that MAC address if MAC authentication was happening. But look, my MacBook will always be a MacBook. It will never be an Epson printer. There are things that we do that lets us identify what that device really is behind that MAC address. And this has ties into things like IPAN systems, Infoblocks, efficient IP, where we can leverage integration between the DHCP server as well as ClearPass. But going back to what I said, my MacBook will always be a MacBook. So going back to what I said about the foundation of building this out, this zero trust networking, is visibility. So using the fingerprinting and profiling to drive that authentication for headless devices is where I would encourage you to be going. Do not continue to use MAC authentication-based approach for these headless devices. You need to be tying it in with the visibility construct, the fingerprinting and profiling for these headless devices. Because you can't put an agent on there. You can't load software. They just don't allow it. So that visibility piece, again, comes full circle. Very, very important. Skip that. I'm going to skip that and move on to this one because I'm running out of time. I've got 3 or 4 minutes left. This drives this piece as well, right? Wireless is easy. Wired, sometimes people think is much more difficult to deliver a zero trust network than 802.1x, and it's completely thud in the marketplace. I strongly believe that delivering .1x and delivering enterprise-grade security on switching is not difficult. But what I want to talk to you about here is something we call colorless ports. And this works across, as you'll see, we don't say Aruba switches, we just say it's a switch, right? So devices that do not that connected by wired, but they do not do .1x. Using that concept I talked about for profiling and fingerprinting drives this concept of colorless ports. I used to call it universal port. And what it basically means is, however you connect a device, via the concept of fingerprinting and profiling, allows us to basically deliver the configuration to that switch port real time. So you don't have to have the concept of ports 1 to 10 are for VLAN 1, ports 11 to 15 are for VLAN 50, or the concept of red ports, red cables or green cables and blue cables. The concept of colorless ports is you plug any device into the wired infrastructure, Cisco, Aruba, Brocade, doesn't really matter. Policy manager will identify that device and set the relevant authentication in that switch port. You unplug it and replug it somewhere else, the policy follows it. So it's a concept that I think, again, simplifies your infrastructure, a bit like the concept of roles, but actually delivers more security because the policy follows the device. You don't have this hard, nailed up infrastructure of VLANs or using certain cables for certain types of devices. I want to simplify it, but I want to deliver more security. And then that drives into my last section, and that's this concept of segmentation. I think every enterprise in the world today is challenged with segmenting devices. This concept of connect everything and everything is driving the requirements for segmentation. And it means different things to different people. But fundamentally, we're using the concept and the building blocks and foundations of like Policy Manager to identify devices, then use the concept of roles to be able to basically then drive this segmentation. The old approach on the left was, these ports were orange or green or blue. These were printer ports. These were camera ports. These were laptop ports or whatever. The world we need to transition to is this concept on the right-hand side. And it's taking that concept of colorless ports for wireless, but it's basically abstracting everything to a role. And a role allows us to drive dynamic segmentation, or just macro or micro segmentation across wired and wireless. So regardless of how devices are connected, we can group them together to ensure that they are only able to access similar or like applications. And I think segmentation is something that a lot of companies are struggling with, but the concept of roles, I think, becomes, again, a foundation to delivering segmentation in the enterprise. And this is the way to visualize it. Whether you want to segment based upon faculty or user groupings, whether it's device type or data type, the concept only shows it here for a wireless infrastructure, but it applies the same for wired, using certainly policy manager as the decision point to basically decide what devices are, what users are, how they should be segmented. It drives the concept of segmentation. This is nothing new in Aruba. We've been doing this ever since we basically delivered the concept of a role. So things like segmentation on wired and wireless, it's what we've been doing to adaptive security and policy manager for 15 years. I just feel that the world's caught up with the way we want to drive security in Aruba, which is great. We're just telling it in a slightly different way. So that's about what I had for you today. Just about got through in time. You can contact me. Very simple email address, just jump@hpe.com. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or queries. But for now, let me pass it back to our host.
Thank you, Danny.
Take any questions, I think.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Danny, for that very thorough and informative presentation. I think for sure we all have a far clearer understanding of Aruba and Switchshop's approach to cybersecurity. We've had great engagement from the audience throughout. Some questions ready to go. So starting from the top, how does ClearPass profile and identify devices that don't support protocols such as 802.1x?
Good question, Matt. I see Matt's been busy on the questions. There's 3 from Matt here. So, Matt, the foundations of fingerprinting and profiling really have got nothing to do with .1x. It's driven off things like DHCP signatures, TCP signatures, user agents on devices, or the concept of basically interfacing with other systems you have on your network and allowing me to ingest information about the device from those systems. For example, MDM systems, EDR systems, EPP systems, where you have other agents installed. We interface with those platforms and they basically provide information. If you don't allow us to interface with those other third-party systems, MDM, EDR systems, then really the foundation of DHCP signatures, TCP, user agents, basically provides a very high level of information that lets us build and gain information around what those devices are. Does that answer your question, hopefully? I'm not sure whether they can respond. Yeah. Can they respond? I don't know.
No, not live on time. So we'll go to question number 2. How could ClearPass help us to deploy better network segmentation? Are there any other Aruba solution elements we would need to deploy micro-segmentation?
For Matt again, I see. So Matt, no, I mean, I touched on this. The segmentation is a challenge I think every enterprise is faced with. And it sounds like you have it as well. It's certainly maybe front of mind for you. Regardless of what your wired or wireless vendor is, there is an element of segmentation we can deliver today. There's a more granular segmentation story we have with Aruba wired and wireless. We have, of our 10,000 customers, I can tell you hand on heart, 2,000 of them have got no Aruba infrastructure, wired or wireless deployed. And we have some very large segmentation projects driven through roles, driven through things like downloadable ACLs, where they're using, again, policy manager to be the decision point, what drives that segmentation. But no, within Aruba, if it's just an Aruba infrastructure, then Policy Manager is the only product you need to drive, in addition to the Aruba Wide and Wireless, if you like, to drive that segmentation story.
Great. And then we have a third question. Does this kind of integration work with other vendors, Palo Alto, for instance?
Yeah, very extensively. The Palo Alto story goes back about eight years, almost to the start of my tenure here. And if you were to go to asp.arubanetworks.com, ASP is the Aruba support portal, and just search on Palo Alto, you'll find the latest version of the Fortinet integration guide, the Palo Alto integration guide. Go look at the revisions on the Palo Alto guide. It's on like version 9. So we've, like I said, we've continued to go back and work with these vendors, our partners, to deliver more integrations. So the concept of using the role within Palo Alto, it's called a tag. The tag basically falls into something called a dynamic access group. That is what's used to drive the to federate the role into Palo Altos. And there's other things that we do. Again, they can send us alerts via syslog that we can ingest to trigger workflows for quarantine and captive portals and things like that. And we also have another integration that's fairly niche with Palo Alto around Global Protect VPN access, which is pretty sexy. Again, that's actually covered in that guide that I pointed you to, asp.arubanetworks.com. You'll find that guide there.
Correct. So unless there's anything else to add from your side, Danny, I think we have come to the end of the questions. So we are okay to sign off. We'd like to thank everybody for taking part today. We will be emailing the slide deck to those participants. If we get any late questions in, we will obviously answer those as well. And just a last reminder for the polls, if anybody didn't get to that during the webinar, if they could have a look at it now, please. And then finally, just to draw your attention to the last of in the series of the webinars, we have on the 21st of October, securing your data. So we hope you can join us for that. Okay, so thank you all very much. Have a good evening.